The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, their light dancing across crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Every sound was elegant, the quiet hum of laughter, the soft clink of cutlery, the muted notes of a violin trio in the corner. It was the kind of place where secrets hid behind charm and danger wore a smile. Ethan Vale sat at the center table, surrounded by people who pretended to adore him. The CEO of Vale Industries, powerful, unreadable, and too composed for anyone to guess how tired he was of the world that worshipped his money. His dark suit fit him perfectly, sharp as his gaze. Yet tonight there was something heavier about him, a quiet restlessness beneath the polished surface. He swirled the champagne glass in his hand, watching the golden bubbles rise, unaware that every shimmer inside it carried more than celebration. Around him, his so-called friends toasted his success. New contracts, new expansions, new power. They smiled too wide, their laughter too rehearsed, and Ethan, ever the strategist, smiled back. Then, as he raised the glass to his lips, a soft, trembling hand touched his wrist. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but it stopped him. Startled, he looked up. She stood beside him, a young waitress with flushed cheeks, her blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail, a nervous tremor in her breath. She wasn't like the others, not polished, not confident, but alive with something raw and urgent. In her other hand, she held a small folded napkin, pressed tight as if it were her only lifeline. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't drink that." Ethan's brow furrowed. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. Her voice shook again, quieter this time. "Please, just don't." Then she slipped the napkin into his hand, her fingers brushing against his, cold, trembling, real. He opened it under the table, hiding it with his palm. Written in rushed, uneven handwriting were 5 words that made his blood turn to ice. "Don't drink it and leave now." His heartbeat slowed, but his expression didn't change. Years in boardrooms and betrayals had trained him to never show reaction. Slowly, he set the glass down, his eyes rising to meet hers. She looked terrified, glancing over her shoulder toward a nearby table. Ethan followed her gaze, and caught the faintest smirk from his business partner, Mr. Harland, who was lifting his own glass in a mock toast. Something sharp clicked into place inside Ethan's mind. He turned back to the waitress. "Why?" he asked quietly. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Fear darkened her eyes, not for herself, but for him. Then, with the softest breath, she said, "You don't have time to ask." He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer. The violin music swelled again, almost mocking in its elegance. Around them, people laughed, unaware that a man's life was seconds from ending. Ethan pushed his chair back slowly, calm and deliberate. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "I need a moment." As he walked toward the exit, the folded napkin burned in his hand. Behind him, the waitress exhaled shakily, her hands gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't know what would happen next, only that she might have just saved a man's life, or ruined her own. The grand hallway outside the ballroom was dim and quiet, the soft hum of the celebration fading behind tall gilded doors. Ethan's polished shoes clicked steadily against the marble as he walked, his expression unreadable. But beneath that calm, something colder was forming. His mind, sharp and calculating, ran through every possibility, every betrayal that could hide behind a poisoned glass. He stopped near a tall window, the city lights glittering against the night sky beyond it. The folded napkin was still in his hand, its ink slightly smudged from the warmth of his palm. He turned it over once, then again, reading the same desperate words that had already carved themselves into his thoughts. "Don't drink it. And leave now." Behind him, footsteps echoed softly, quick, hesitant. He turned just as the waitress from the ballroom slipped through the door, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with fear. The faint tremor in her hands hadn't gone away. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, voice low but commanding. "I had to," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They're watching you. You can't go back in there." Ethan stepped closer, his presence almost unnerving in its calm. "Who?" Her throat worked as she swallowed hard. "Your business partner, Mr. Harland," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I heard him earlier in the kitchen talking to a man. They said you'd never see sunrise." Her words hit with the precision of a knife. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left hers. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," she said quickly. "I just I couldn't watch it happen. Please, you need to get out before they realize I warned you. Her fear was real. Ethan could feel it. She wasn't acting, and she wasn't clever enough to fake this kind of trembling desperation. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he asked quietly, "Why help me? You don't even know who I am." She hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "Because I know what it's like to be silenced," she murmured. "My brother used to work for Harland. He found out something he wasn't supposed to. He tried to expose it, and then he just disappeared." Her voice broke slightly, eyes glistening. "I couldn't let another person die because of them." For a brief second, the walls around Ethan's heart cracked. He saw not just a waitress, but a sister still haunted by loss. Courage hidden beneath fear. The kind of courage money couldn't buy. "Your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. "Lena Harper." He nodded once, remembering it. "Listen, Lena," he said evenly. "You're not going back in there. They'll know you warned me." Her eyes widened. "If I leave, I'll lose my job. I have rent to pay, my mother's medicine." "You saved my life," Ethan interrupted softly but firmly. "You won't lose anything." He reached for his phone, dialing his head of security. "This is Vale," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Find Harland, quietly check the champagne." Then he hung up and looked at Lena again. "Come with me." She hesitated, glancing back toward the ballroom. The laughter inside was still echoing faintly, oblivious, elegant, deadly. She took a deep breath and nodded. As they walked side by side through the service corridor, the air grew colder. The hum of the party faded completely, replaced by the hum of the city outside. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his hand tightened slightly at his side. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. Someone had tried to end him, and a stranger had just risked everything to save him. Lena didn't know what kind of world she had stepped into. Ethan didn't know why he suddenly cared that she had. But both understood one thing. From that moment, nothing about either of their lives would ever be the same again. Inside the ballroom, laughter rang a little too loud, the glow of champagne glasses masking the quiet tension that was about to break. The air shimmered with luxury, the smell of roses, fine wine, and something far more poisonous beneath. None of the guests knew that in a few moments the celebration would turn into chaos. Ethan stood just beyond the doorway, his phone still warm from the call he had just made. Through the small crack between the doors, he could see Harland at the table, smiling too easily, leaning back in his chair like a man who believed the world belonged to him. For years, Harland had been at Ethan's side, his most trusted business partner, the one person he thought he didn't have to watch. And now, looking at that smug grin, Ethan realized how blind trust could kill. Beside him, Lena stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway. Her hands were trembling around her apron, her eyes darting between the ballroom doors and Ethan's expression. She didn't belong in his world, a world of suits and power. But at that moment, she was the only person who had been brave enough to see the danger. "What's going to happen?" she whispered. Ethan glanced at her, voice low. "Justice." A few seconds later, the double doors opened, and his head of security entered the ballroom. The movement was subtle, professional. Two other men followed, moving toward the bar and the kitchen exit. The violinist continued to play, unaware that the music was about to become the background to something darker. Then came the sound of a shattered glass. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a warning bell. Heads turned. Harland froze mid-toast as one of the security officers lifted Ethan's untouched champagne glass from the table. The contents shimmered faintly under the chandelier light. Then the officer poured a few drops into a small vial. He looked up and nodded grimly. The room fell silent. Ethan walked in, calm and composed, his every step echoing across the marble floor. "Interesting choice of drink tonight, Harland," he said smoothly. "You always did have expensive taste. Pity about your methods." Harland's confident smile faltered. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan stopped in front of him, eyes cold. "You tell me." "My security found traces of cyanide in this glass. The same one poured by your man. The same one you handed to me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone gasped. Another backed away. Harland's face drained of color. "That's absurd," he said, his voice shaking. "You can't prove—" "Actually," Ethan interrupted, holding up the napkin Lena had given him, "someone already did." The room turned to where Lena stood, small and frightened by the sudden attention. She wanted to disappear, but Ethan's voice anchored her. She saw what you planned. She warned me. That's the only reason I'm alive. Harlan's panic broke through his composure. You're going to believe a waitress over me? Ethan's tone sharpened, calm but lethal. I'm going to believe the person who risked her life to tell me the truth. You? You sold yours for power. Security surrounded Harlan as the color drained completely from his face. He started shouting, excuses, threats, broken fragments of lies. But no one was listening anymore. The guests whispered. The music stopped, and the empire Harlan thought he'd control crumbled in an instant. Ethan turned away, his gaze softening as it landed on Lena. Let's go, he said quietly. She hesitated, but I'll be fired. They'll think I was part of it. They won't touch you, he interrupted, stepping closer, his voice steady and protective. Not while I'm standing here. They walked out together through the side door, slipping into the cold night air. Snowflakes drifted gently down, glowing under the streetlights. Lena hugged her arms around herself, shivering in her thin uniform. Without a word, Ethan took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Because you did, he said simply. The sound of distant sirens grew faint behind them as security handled what remained inside. Ethan opened his car door, motioning for her to get in. She hesitated, still caught between fear and disbelief. I didn't do it for a reward, she said softly. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Not pity, not gratitude, but a quiet respect that felt heavier than either. I know, he said. That's why it matters. As they drove off into the falling snow, neither spoke again for a while. The city lights blurred through the windshield, and for the first time that night, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not from his wealth or his power, but from the courage of a stranger who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And beside him, Lena stared out the window, heart pounding, realizing she'd crossed a line that could never be undone. But somehow she wasn't afraid anymore. She'd saved a man's life. She just didn't know yet that he was about to change hers forever. The city lights flickered past the window as silence filled the space between them. The tension of the ballroom still lingered, but the sound of tires gliding over wet streets felt oddly calming. Snow had begun to fall more heavily now, blanketing the world in quiet. The inside of the car was warm, dimly lit by the soft glow of the dashboard. Lena sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her fingers clutching the edge of Ethan's coat wrapped tightly around her. She hadn't realized how cold she'd been until now, or how much she was shaking. Ethan glanced at her from the corner of his eye, noticing how she tried to hide it. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been all night. Lena gave a small, nervous laugh. Afraid? I just accused one of the most powerful men in your company of trying to poison you. In front of everyone. I think terrified might be the better word. Ethan's lips curved slightly, and not a smile exactly, but something close. And yet you still did it. I couldn't just watch, she murmured, her gaze falling to her lap. He slipped something into your drink while you were talking to that investor. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then I saw his face. The way he looked at you, like he was already celebrating. Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands together to stop them from trembling. I almost didn't write the note. I thought maybe I'd get fired or worse, but something in me said I had to. Ethan slowed the car as they reached a red light. The snowflakes shimmered in the air, landing softly on the windshield and melting away. You saved my life, Lena, he said, turning toward her fully. His tone wasn't formal anymore, not the clipped, commanding voice of a CEO, but raw, steady, and real. You trusted your instincts when no one else would have dared. That's not something I'll forget. Her throat tightened. Anyone would have done the same. He shook his head. No, most people see danger and look away. You ran toward it. The light turned green, but Ethan didn't move right away. The car behind them honked softly, and only then did he press the accelerator again. They drove in silence for another minute before Lena finally spoke again. So what happens now? To Harland? Police will handle it, he said evenly. I've already sent the security footage. His accounts, his movements, everything will be traced. He won't hurt anyone else. She nodded slowly, though the weight of the night hadn't lifted. And me? Ethan's expression softened. You're safe. I'll make sure of it. Something in the way he said it, calm, certain, unshakable, made her chest ache unexpectedly. She wasn't used to being protected. For most of her life, she'd learned to protect herself, to stay invisible. But tonight she'd been seen, truly seen, and by someone who lived in a world she'd only ever served from the edges. They turned onto a quieter street lined with old lampposts, the kind that gave off a warm, golden glow. Ethan pulled the car to a stop in front of a small cafe, its windows fogged and lights still on despite the late hour. "They're open 24 hours, he said gently. "You should eat something before I take you home." She hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, his gaze meeting hers. "After everything that happened tonight, the least I can do is make sure you're okay." Lena finally nodded, the corners of her lips lifting in a faint, tired smile. Together they stepped into the cafe. The smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around them instantly, a comforting contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. They chose a quiet corner booth far from the few late-night customers scattered around. For the first time that night, Ethan let himself exhale fully. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy realization of what could have been. He looked at the woman across from him, her hair slightly messy, eyes red from exhaustion, and wondered how a stranger had managed to see what no one else had. Lena stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, glancing up to find him watching her. "What?" she asked softly. He leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're not what I expected." She raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "Someone who'd look away," he said simply. "You didn't." Lena didn't answer. She just stared at him, her heart catching at the quiet sincerity in his words. Outside snow kept falling, muffling the world into stillness. And for a brief moment, the chaos of the night didn't feel so overwhelming. It felt like something had shifted, as if the danger had brought them to this one fragile, unexpected connection that neither of them could explain. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, but he ignored it. For once, the world could wait. Tonight, he wasn't a CEO fighting betrayal. He was just a man who had almost lost his life, and the woman across from him was the reason he hadn't. The following morning broke quietly over the city, sunlight glinting off rooftops still dusted with snow. For Ethan, it didn't feel like just another day of meetings and power plays. Something inside him had shifted. He sat at his office window, coffee in hand, replaying every second of the night before. The trembling note, Lena's eyes full of fear and courage, the way she had stood her ground even when the world around her could have crushed her for speaking. His assistant's voice broke the silence. "Sir, the police confirmed everything. The champagne was poisoned. Harlan's been charged." Ethan nodded without turning. "Good. Make sure his shares are frozen immediately." "Yes, sir." There was a pause. "The woman who warned you, Miss Harper, she's been asking if she can return to work. The hotel management wants to know if you'd like to handle it personally." Ethan set down his cup slowly. "Personally," he said, his voice calm but decisive. Later that afternoon, Lena stood nervously in the gleaming lobby of Vale Industries, her coat clutched tightly around her. Everything about the place screamed power, the polished marble floors, the glass walls, the hum of quiet authority. She didn't belong here. She knew it. Yet, when the elevator doors opened and Ethan's assistant beckoned her in, she stepped forward anyway. The elevator climbed soundlessly, carrying her toward a man she still couldn't quite understand. A man whose life she'd saved, but who had changed the course of hers in return. When the door slid open, Ethan was standing by his desk, his back to her, city skyline stretching wide behind him. "Miss Harper," he said without turning, his tone softer than she remembered. "You came." "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted, stepping closer. "I didn't want to cause more trouble." He finally faced her, and the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. "You caused the opposite." He motioned toward a chair. "Sit, please." She did, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Ethan sat across from her, studying her face, the quiet strength behind her uncertainty, the kindness behind her exhaustion. "You said you've lost your job because of what happened," he began. "That shouldn't have happened." "I understand," she said quickly. "They were scared. The hotel doesn't want bad publicity. I don't blame them." "I do," Ethan said simply. "You did the right thing when no one else did." "That's exactly the kind of person I need at my company." Lena blinked. "At your company?" He nodded. Head of Staff Relations. It's not just hospitality, and it's about people. Real people. Something I've forgotten to prioritize. His gaze softened. You reminded me of that. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The offer didn't make sense. It was too generous, too surreal. Mr. Vale, I'm not qualified for something like that. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You're qualified for integrity, for courage, for empathy. The rest can be learned. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the city below. Lena's eyes shimmered, her breath catching. Why are you doing this for me? He hesitated, then said quietly, because you didn't have to care, but you did. And I don't want you to think that went unseen. For a long moment, she just looked at him, the man everyone called cold and untouchable, and saw not a CEO, but someone who had been saved from a loneliness deeper than the poison meant for him. She finally nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. Days turned into weeks, and their worlds slowly began to overlap in ways neither had expected. Lena brought warmth to the sterile corridors of Vale Industries. She remembered people's names, their birthdays, their small struggles. She smiled at the janitors, listened to interns, reminded the company that behind every polished report was a beating heart. Ethan found himself watching her more than he should, drawn to the way she made people feel seen. He started showing up to parts of the office he hadn't visited in years, finding excuses to speak with her. One evening, he caught her in the break room, standing by the window as snow began to fall again. The city lights blurred behind her reflection, and for a moment she looked almost like she belonged to a softer world than his. You still wear the same coat, he said, his voice breaking the silence. She turned, smiling faintly. It's yours, remember? You never asked for it back. He took a slow step closer. Maybe I didn't want it back. Her heartbeat quickened, but she didn't look away. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked quietly. They're true. Lena's eyes shimmered in the dim light. Because people like us, we don't belong in the same story. Ethan's voice softened to almost a whisper. Then maybe it's time to change the story. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was full, of gratitude, of fear, of something growing that neither could name yet. Outside, snow drifted gently against the window pane, soft and endless. Lena turned back to the window, but her lips trembled with the faintest fragile smile. Ethan watched her for a long time, realizing that for all the years he'd spent building empires, it was this quiet, honest connection that had finally brought him peace. He'd been saved once by her warning, but now in a quieter, deeper way, he knew she was saving him again, from the emptiness of a life that had forgotten what it meant to be truly alive. The snow had stopped falling by the time the city lights began to fade into morning, leaving a pale calmness over the skyline. Inside Vale Tower, the warmth of progress hummed quietly. Employees chatting, phones ringing, life moving forward. Yet for Ethan, something in the rhythm of his world had begun to change. He found himself pausing in places he used to rush through. The boardroom, once his battlefield, now felt less like victory and more like routine. The only part of his day that felt alive was when he saw her. Lena, moving through the office with her quiet confidence, her laughter soft but real. She brought light into corners that had never known it. But peace, Ethan knew, was a fragile thing, and fragile things never lasted long. It started one Thursday morning when his assistant came in looking uneasy. Sir, she began hesitantly, there's a journalist in the lobby asking about Miss Harper. Ethan frowned, setting down his pen. About what? She claims Lena used to work for a logistics firm owned by Harland. There's an old case, something about a financial irregularity. It was closed, but it has her name on the witness list. Ethan felt the room go still. A witness? Yes, sir. She testified and against Harland's company. Apparently her brother was part of the case before he disappeared. The air tightened around him. Harland again, of course. Ethan stood, jaw clenching. Tell the journalist nothing. I'll handle it. Minutes later, he found Lena in the staff lounge, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up when he entered, her expression softening, unaware of the storm brewing in his eyes. Hey, she said with a faint smile. You look like you didn't sleep. He didn't smile back. Why didn't you tell me you knew Harland before? The question hit her like a gust of wind. Her fingers froze around the mug. Because it wasn't important anymore, she said quietly. It's important now, he replied, his tone calm but edged. There's a journalist downstairs asking questions about you, about a case involving Harland, your brother, and missing company funds. Her lips parted, the color draining from her face. I didn't steal anything. I swear, Ethan, my brother worked under him. He found out that Harland was moving money through fake accounts. When he tried to expose it, Harland ruined him, fired him, threatened him, and then he just disappeared. Her voice cracked and she looked down, blinking away tears. I testified, yes. But nothing came of it. They said there wasn't enough proof. Harland made sure of that. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, the edges of his anger softening. He had seen the kind of fear and courage it took to stand up to someone like Harland. He had been there himself, but the old wound of betrayal, of being blindsided by the people closest to him, made his trust hesitate for just a moment too long. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked quieter this time. Lena's hands tightened around the mug. Because I didn't want to be another problem for you to solve. You gave me a chance when no one else would. I didn't want you to see me as a reminder of him. He took a step closer, but she backed away slightly, her eyes glistening. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I stayed invisible, I could finally build something good again. But I guess my past doesn't want to let me. Lena, he said gently, his voice softening, you don't have to hide from me. But she shook her head. You don't understand, Ethan, you can't. You live in a world where people like me are liabilities. The moment your board finds out I'm connected to Harland, they'll question you. Your judgment, your loyalty. They'll think I'm just another risk. He hesitated, the truth of her words landing heavy. Then I'll deal with them, he said. You're not going anywhere. Her eyes lifted to his, a flicker of disbelief there. You can't protect me from this forever. Watch me, he said quietly. For a moment she wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself lean into the warmth in his eyes, the steadiness of his voice. But she had seen what powerful men did when their reputations were threatened. They didn't hold on, they let go first. So that night, long after the office lights dimmed, Lena left a letter on his desk. Just one page. Handwritten, trembling slightly where the ink had smudged. Ethan, thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me a chance at a life I thought I'd lost. But I can't let my past destroy everything you've built. I hope one day you'll understand. When Ethan found it the next morning, his chest went still. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Not because of business or betrayal, but because the one person who had reminded him how to feel had slipped away quietly, out of reach. He stood by his window again, the skyline blurring beyond the glass. The city was waking up and bright, alive, relentless. But to him it felt hollow. The woman who had once saved his life was now the one thing he couldn't save. And somewhere out there, Lena walked through the quiet streets with a small bag over her shoulder. Her heart breaking and steady all at once, believing she was protecting him, never knowing she was the only thing that had ever truly healed him. The moment Ethan read the last line of Lena's letter, something inside him fractured, a soundless breaking that no one else could hear. He stared at the page until the words blurred, his hand tightening until the paper crumpled slightly. His office, usually a sanctuary of control, now felt suffocating, filled with echoes of her laughter, her voice, the warmth she carried like light. For hours he sat behind his desk, motionless. His assistant knocked twice, asking if he wanted to attend the shareholders' call, but he dismissed her with a quiet, "Cancel everything." When the door shut again, the silence pressed in harder. He reached for his phone and dialed security. "I need access to the lobby footage from last night," he said, voice low and restrained. Within minutes, his monitors filled with grainy recordings. He watched her, Lena, walking through the glass doors with her coat pulled tight, her shoulders trembling. She paused once, looking back up toward the top floor where his office lights still glowed. Then she turned and disappeared into the snow. That single glance back shattered him more than he wanted to admit. "Tracer card activity," he ordered. "Bank ID, anything you can find." "Sir, with all due respect," his head of security hesitated. "If she left voluntarily—" "Do it," Ethan interrupted sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. By nightfall, his car was cutting through the icy streets of the lower city. The Vale name meant nothing here. No one cared about CEOs or luxury or power. It was a place of worn-down apartment blocks, flickering streetlights, and quiet desperation. The kind of place Lena had survived long before she ever stepped into his world. He found her address from an old HR record. A tiny one-bedroom apartment at the end of a narrow street. The snow crunched under his shoes as he climbed the steps. He hesitated outside the door, his breath clouding the air. For a long moment, he just stood there, uncertain what he would even say. He knocked, no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He tried the handle, it opened easily. Inside, the small room was dim, the air cold. Most of her belongings were gone, the drawers empty, the bed neatly made. On the table sat a single photo, a young boy and girl standing by a lake. Her and her brother, smiling, carefree, before everything fell apart. Next to it lay another folded note. His name was written on it. He opened it slowly, afraid of what he might read. "I know you'll come looking for me, Ethan. That's why I couldn't let you find me. You've already done enough. You gave me safety when I had none. But now I need to face the truth about what happened to my brother, even if it means going back into the dark. Please don't follow me." His throat tightened. The anger, the pain, the helplessness, it all twisted together. She wasn't running from him. She was walking straight into danger, alone. He sank into the nearest chair, running a hand through his hair. Every instinct in him, the strategist, the leader, the man who built empires from ashes, screamed to do something. But this wasn't a hostile takeover. This was someone he couldn't command back into safety. For the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't afraid of losing control. He was afraid of losing her. He stood abruptly, his decision made. He wasn't going to let her face Harlan's shadow by herself. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number only a few trusted allies knew. "Connor," he said when the man answered. "I need eyes on Harlan's people. I think Lena Harper is in danger. Find her before they do. Ethan, you're treading into something ugly. Harlan still has connections." "Then so do I," Ethan snapped. "Use them." He ended the call and stepped back outside into the cold. Snow began to fall again, gentle and silent. He looked up at the sky, the flakes catching the city lights like falling stars. Somewhere beneath that same sky, Lena was moving through the dark, chasing the truth that had destroyed her family. And now Ethan was chasing her. Not because she had saved him once, but because she had become something he didn't believe in anymore. Something pure. Something worth fighting for. He got into his car, the engine roaring to life. The city stretched ahead of him, vast, unpredictable, and dangerous. But this time, Ethan Vale wasn't the untouchable CEO the world knew. He was a man with a heart on fire, and he wasn't stopping until he brought her home. The city was a blur of neon and ice as Ethan's car sliced through the night. His phone buzzed every few minutes. Connor's updates coming in quick, clipped messages that only made his pulse quicken. "Spotted her near the old pier. Warehouse district. She's not alone." That was all it took. Ethan's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the snow turning into streaks of white against the windshield. He didn't remember half the turns he made. He just followed instinct. The same instinct that had made him trust a stranger with a trembling hand and terrified eyes. By the time he reached the pier, the wind had picked up. The old warehouses loomed like silent sentinels, their windows black and empty. The smell of salt and rust hung in the air. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against the frozen docks. He killed the engine and stepped out, his breath sharp in the cold. The only light came from a flickering street lamp and the faint orange glow bleeding out from one of the warehouse windows. He moved toward it slowly, quietly, every step measured. Inside, Lena stood near the far wall, her hands raised slightly as two men in dark coats circled her. Her face was pale but steady, her eyes fierce even as her voice shook. "I don't want trouble," she said, holding a small USB drive in her fingers. "I just want to know what happened to my brother." "That's it," one of the men chuckled. "You shouldn't have come here asking questions. Mr. Harlan doesn't like ghosts being stirred." "Maybe he shouldn't have killed them then," she shot back, her voice cracking. The man stepped closer. "Careful, sweetheart. Brave doesn't mean bulletproof." Before he could take another step, Ethan's voice echoed through the warehouse, low and cutting through the air like steel. "Step away from her." All three of them froze. Lena's head snapped toward the sound, disbelief flooding her face. "Ethan?" she breathed. The two men turned. Ethan Vale stood in the doorway, his black coat dusted with snow, eyes dark and unyielding. He moved forward slowly, his presence alone enough to make the air tense. "Mr. Vale," one of the men said with mock politeness. "Didn't expect to see you down here. This isn't your world." Ethan gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You'd be surprised how many worlds I own." He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze locked on Lena. "You should have waited for me." She shook her head. "I couldn't. You would have tried to stop me." "You're damn right I would have," he said softly. The man beside her moved, his hand slipping inside his coat. But Ethan's reaction was instant. A flick of motion, a flash of silver as he swung a heavy wrench from the floor, striking the man's arm and sending the weapon skidding across the concrete. The other lunged, but Ethan caught him by the collar, slamming him hard against a metal crate. Lena gasped, frozen for a heartbeat, then grabbed the fallen gun, pointing it with trembling hands. "Stay down," she yelled at the man, trying to rise. Her voice was shaking, but her stance was steady. The first man groaned, clutching his arm, glaring up at Ethan. "You think this changes anything? Harland owns half this city." "Not anymore," Ethan cut in coldly, "because tonight I take the other half." He leaned closer, voice lowering to something dangerous. "Tell him this. If he comes near her again, I'll make sure every name he's buried in his book sees daylight." The man swallowed hard and didn't move. Ethan turned to Lena, his expression softening, his voice quieter now. "Let's go." But she hesitated. "I found something," she said, holding out the USB. "It's proof. Harlan's been laundering money through offshore accounts, the same ones tied to my brother's case. This could expose everything." He took the drive gently from her hand, their fingers brushing. "Then we'll use it together." Her lips trembled. "You shouldn't have come here. They could have—" "I told you," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and certain. "I'm not letting you fight this alone." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension that had once been fear melted into something heavier, something that felt like the truth they had both been avoiding. Then a noise shattered the stillness. Tires screeching outside, headlights flashing through the cracks in the wall. More men. Ethan grabbed her hand. "We're leaving. Now." They ran through the back of the warehouse, their footsteps echoing against the cold steel walls. The wind hit them like knives as they burst through the rear door into the storm. Behind them, shouts erupted, engines roared. Ethan tightened his grip on Lena's hand as they sprinted across the dock. She stumbled once on the slick boards, but he caught her, pulling her close. "I've got you," he said, breathless but steady. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Connor's doing, no doubt. They ducked behind a stack of shipping containers as police cars flooded the pier, lights flashing red and blue across the snow. For a long, frozen moment, they just sat there, backs against the metal, breathing hard. Finally, Lena turned to him, her voice soft. "Why did you come?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes tired but fierce. "Because you once saved my life," he said. "And somewhere between that moment and this one, you became my reason to keep it." She blinked, tears catching in her lashes, and for the first time since the night they met, she didn't argue, didn't run. She just leaned forward and let the quiet between them speak for everything neither of them could say. Outside, the sirens faded. The danger wasn't over, but for now they were alive, together, and that, for both of them, was enough. The world moved quickly in the days that followed. What began as a single night of fear and snow turned into headlines, investigations, and boardroom chaos. Ethan Vale's name filled every news ticker, every morning broadcast, not for a new deal, not for scandal, but for truth. The files on the USB drive were explosive. Offshore accounts, false subsidiaries, forged contracts. It was all there, and Harlan's signature was written across nearly every document. Within hours of the leak, federal agents raided Harlan's offices. He tried to flee the country, but Ethan's team, and the evidence Lena had risked her life to bring, made sure he never got the chance. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt quiet, heavy, earned through too much pain. Ethan stood in front of the massive glass window of his office, the city skyline gleaming under a pale winter sun. His reflection stared back, the face of a man who'd built empires and broken walls but had almost lost the one thing that mattered most. Behind him, the door opened softly. Lena stepped inside. She looked different now. Not the frightened waitress or the desperate woman chasing ghosts, but someone lighter, steadier. Her coat was unbuttoned, her hair loose, her eyes tired but warm. "They dropped the charges," she said quietly. "Against my brother's name. They said he was innocent after all this time. Ethan turned slowly, his chest tightening. He deserved that. She nodded, looking down, a small smile flickering at the corner of her lips. You made it happen, Ethan. I couldn't have done it without you. He shook his head. You started it. You had the courage to go after the truth, even when it almost destroyed you. Lena walked closer, stopping beside him by the window. The silence between them was thick but gentle. For the first time in months, there were no secrets left to hide. They offered me a position, she said after a moment. At the foundation, you're funding for corporate transparency. They want me to help oversee ethics investigations. She smiled, faintly unsure. It feels strange, going from a waitress to this. He turned to her, eyes softening. It's exactly where you belong. You've earned every step of it. She studied him then, her gaze tracing the exhaustion on his face, the faint shadow of sadness he tried to mask with calm. You look tired, she murmured. You haven't rested since it all happened, have you? He gave a quiet laugh. Rest doesn't come easy these days. Too many things to fix, too many ghosts in the system. Then maybe, she said softly, it's time to stop fixing everything and start healing something instead. Ethan blinked at her words. She wasn't just talking about the company, and they both knew it. She took a small step closer, the space between them melting away. You told me once I didn't have to hide from you, she whispered. I think you don't have to hide either. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The guarded lines of his face eased, his voice barely above a whisper. I was so afraid you'd never come back. I almost didn't, she admitted. But I realized running from you wasn't the same as protecting you. I just needed to stop being scared of being cared for. The words hit him deeper than she knew. He reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. You're not the only one learning that, he said. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, glittering against the glass. Inside, everything felt still. Ethan looked down at her, his hand still lingering near her cheek. You changed my life, Lena. Not because you saved it, but because you reminded me what it means to live it. Her eyes shimmered, and for once, she didn't look away. Then maybe we both found something we weren't looking for. He smiled, the first real smile in months. Something worth keeping. The city stretched beneath them, alive, reborn. The corruption that had haunted them was gone, the truth finally free. But inside that quiet room, something even greater had taken root. Two people who had fought through fear, through betrayal, through the cold, and somehow found warmth in each other. Lena leaned her head lightly against his shoulder as the snow fell harder outside, blanketing the city in white. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, his heart steady for the first time in a long while. No grand declarations, no promises, just a quiet understanding. They had both been broken by the world once, but together, they had learned how to start again. And as the morning light spilled across the skyline, Ethan realized that the most powerful thing he had ever built wasn't an empire, it was a second chance. The evening air was cool, drifting softly through the penthouse balcony as the city shimmered below. A sea of lights and life that felt a world away from the night everything changed. Ethan stood by the glass railing, his reflection mingling with the skyline. Sharp suit, softened eyes. Beside him, Lena leaned quietly, her hair gently tousled by the breeze, the faint city glow painting her features in gold. They didn't need words. Silence itself had become a language between them. Months had passed since the night she warned him, but in some ways the moment still lived between them, fragile, unspoken, yet binding. Ethan turned toward her, studying her face with the same quiet awe he once reserved for power and success. You told me not to drink that night, he said, his voice low, thoughtful. But what you didn't know, I was already poisoned, not by champagne, but by trust, betrayal, and loneliness. His tone trembled on the edge of emotion, something raw and unguarded. Lena's eyes softened, a faint smile tracing her lips. She reached for his hand, the same hand she had once stopped in fear, now holding it in warmth. Then, she whispered, I guess I'll just have to keep making sure you don't drink the wrong things. Her words carried a lightness, but behind it a promise, quiet, enduring, unspoken yet understood. Ethan squeezed her hand, his gaze drifting back to the city. You changed everything, Lena, he murmured. That night I thought I was walking away from danger, But I was walking toward something far more powerful. She tilted her head. What's that? He turned, meeting her eyes with a smile that reached his soul. You. A soft laugh escaped her as she leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder. The world below moved on, cars, lights, lives, but up here time felt suspended. The hardened CEO who once trusted no one now stood with the woman who had risked everything to protect him. The air felt different, gentler, alive, like a beginning rather than an ending. As snow began to fall once more, faint and fleeting, Ethan brushed a flake from her hair and whispered, almost to himself, for the first time in years, I feel human again. Lena looked up, eyes shimmering. That's all I ever wanted you to feel, she said softly. And under the quiet dance of winter, two broken souls who met in fear now stood in peace, not because fate demanded it, but because one act of courage had rewritten both their lives forever.